This show is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
There's something about summer and getting ready every day that makes me rethink what I'm going to wear. And of course, I want lighter fabrics and better materials, things that feel good on my skin in the moment and also make me feel like I look good. It's one reason I keep coming back to Quince because the focus there is on high quality essentials, breathable fabrics like soft organic cotton, washable silk, my very favorite, breathable linen without the luxury markup. Quince has really beautiful everyday pieces starting at $32. They've got European linen pants and dresses. The denim there is soft and easy to wear. And pretty much everything you will find compares in quality to top brands, but is 50 to 80% less in cost. They work with ethical factories and they basically just cut out the middlemen. So what you're paying for is quality rather than brand markup. They also have stuff for the kitchen. They have bedding, all kinds of things. I have to say this summer, my favorite new Quince item is a tote bag. It's the Italian leather trapeze tote. I am really excited to take it with me as my personal item on plane trips this summer. And maybe you will like something similar. Elevate your summer wardrobe. Go to quince.com/KERA for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. That is QUINCE.com/KERA. Free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/KERA. President Trump's decision to be a partner in Israel's war with Iran has generated a wide range of opinions. But even people who vehemently oppose our involvement in the conflict agree that assassinated Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was bad news for his own people, presiding over a corrupt and repressive regime for decades. From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. The thing is, the Iranian Revolution that overthrew the monarchy in 1979 promised a more democratic, moderate government free from Western interventions, with a free press and an economy built to deliver economic justice to broad segments of the population. We know that hasn't happened. My guest is here to share stories of the Iranians who have not stopped fighting for that kind of society, despite the personal costs. Yeganeh Torbati is a correspondent for the New York Times who covers Iran. Together with Bozogmer Sharafeddin, she is author of the new book, Stolen Revolution, Betrayal and Hope in Modern Iran. Yeganeh, welcome to Think.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris.
Will you start by reminding us what life was like for most Iranians when it was a monarchy under the control of the last Shah?
Of course, Iran today is a country of tens of millions of people with very diverse experiences, and I think that was also the case before the revolution. So it's hard to kind of paint with a broad brush. But I think at that time, Iran's economy was growing, but there was a distinct sense that there was maybe one portion of society that was benefiting from that, and that the Shah was kind of seen in that era as being highly dependent on the West and in particular the United States, and was kind of orienting his government and his country towards kind of Western interests. And there was also, of course, a great deal of repression, especially kind of in the last 2 decades of the Shah's rule. And I think all of these different threads were kind of gathering and sort of resulted in a very distinct and vibrant and quite powerful protest movement sort of in the late 70s.
The sense that the Shah was working too closely with the West and particularly the United States, I mean, in the light of history, was that actually accurate?
I think there's, if we kind of read the history books, there's been a great book written recently on this period called King of Kings. Um, of course, the Shah relied quite a lot on U.S. military support and U.S. military sales, and I think some of the kind of painting of him as an American puppet has been overstated. Private papers and sort of memoirs that have come out since then show that he had a lot of disagreements with kind of U.S. policy, but certainly, he also depended on the U.S. government for certainly his military's power, which I think is what he believed would sort of keep him in power as well.
All right, tell us about Mehdi Karoubi, who became a student of the Ayatollah Khomeini when he was a teenager in the 1950s. Karoubi. What was Karoubi drawn to in Khomeini's teachings?
Yeah, Mehdi Karoubi is kind of one of our main characters, and he's really a fascinating person. He kind of grew up in a very strictly religious household, but also one where he kind of learned from his father that it's important to give to the poor, and that the accumulation of wealth is just not something that a good Muslim should do. And so he was both drawn to the idea that we could institute in Iran, sort of an Islamist government, but also I think saw the power of an Islamist government to deliver sort of social justice for the poor. And his rhetoric and the rhetoric of Khomeini, his teacher, and kind of this overall sense that this sort of revolutionary movement was putting forward was very much kind of in the mold of Imam Ali, who is one of kind of the most revered figures in Shia Islam in particular. And he had a very sort of self-effacing persona, or at least that's how his legacy is presented by Khomeini and his followers. And that was really the kind of sort of framework that Karoubi believed the revolution could sort of bring to the country. This kind of government that's focused first and foremost on, yes, creating kind of an Islamic aligned society, but also one that would work most for the poor.
So before the revolution happened in 1979, what role did Karoubi play in Khomeini's organization that kept getting him in trouble with the regime?
Mhm. He was really one of Khomeini's most devoted activist followers. So he was a cleric himself, and he spread Khomeini's message inside the country. At one point, he visits Khomeini when Khomeini is in exile in Iraq, and comes back with letters and messages for his followers, and kind of was helping to kind of strengthen that network inside the country. And he also kind of takes on a role of collecting funds that were sent by followers to Khomeini, collecting them on his behalf and using that money to really strengthen Khomeini's base of support, and also kind of help those prisoners, the people who had been arrested for their fight against the Shah or for their fight on behalf of Khomeini's movement, helping their families, really strengthening that kind of dissident network so that it could live to see another day, so that the cost of going to prison was not so great that those activists and those clerics would kind of remain in the fight. And so Khomeini, he took a peaceful path. There were others who took up arms, but that was really not his style. But the work that he was doing was quite crucial, and the Shah's secret police, the Savak, went after him. He was imprisoned several times, at times beaten and tortured quite badly, but he remained quite steadfast in his belief and in Khomeini's cause.
When Khomeini expressed criticisms of the Shah before the revolution, was it really evident to anybody paying attention that he was thinking perhaps he would do a better job?
I think many people thought that. I think Khomeini certainly thought that he would do a better job, and I think his criticism sort of started off harsh, but not necessarily calling for the fall of the Shah. But as time went on into the 60s and the 70s, certainly he really came to embrace this idea that the monarchy is kind of an ungodly regime, and in order for us to have a just society, we need to have an Islamic society. And he not only kind of came at it from a fundamentalist Islamist perspective, but he also sort of wove in all these other strands of criticism of the Shah. So, in a speech he gives, he talks about the Shah's repression of the press, He talks about his dependence on the West and poverty and corruption that he was identifying within kind of the monarchic system. And to Khomeini, Islam was the answer to all of these things. Islam had all the laws that man needed for a just society and for a good society. And by kind of stretching his rhetoric to appeal to the left and to communists and even to nationalists and secular liberals, kind of by talking about repression of the press and sort of the torture that, prisoners were undergoing. He kind of used his rhetoric to bring in as broad of a tent as possible in the pre-revolutionary days. That changed, of course, later on.
So, of course, a lot of listeners have only known post-revolutionary Iran. They know it's a theocracy. I mean, how religious was the population of Iran, broadly speaking? What was the sort of variation before the revolution, and what's different today?
I think, I don't know that we have exact statistics, but my sense, my family's Iranian. I have many Iranian friends and, family members that I've spoken to. Um, Certainly the older generation, the generation that was young kind of during the 70s and 80s, tends to be far more religious. And I think, Iran, even the Shah had sort of religious tendencies and a Shia religious identity. It was a country that where religion was really a central part of life. That is still the same, certainly for segments of the population. But we see today, even in polling that's been done by the government, so not some opposition group, not even an outside force, but the government itself asking Iranians, are the people around you more or less religious than they were years ago? And I think that's kind of a proxy question for, are you more or less religious than you were several years ago? We see huge numbers of people saying they're less, the people around them are less religious. We see a much larger support for the idea of the separation of mosque and state. And this poll was conducted in secret. It was leaked to a foreign outlet, and which is why we kind of know these numbers. And I think it's just interesting to kind of have that sort of hard data. Now, some of this may be general to kind of the world. We see sort of many countries with declining religiosity, but I think in interviews that I've conducted with people, I think one big factor is that many people have come to identify Islam as a source of their problems, and the reason for that is because the government has used Islam as kind of a justification for a lot of the things that it undertakes, for some of the repression, for the restrictions that people face in their day-to-day lives. And over time, I think we see in any country, anytime a government tries to force a particular behavior, there's kind of a natural, like almost thermostatic reaction against that. And so over time, we've just seen a more and more secular populace.
It's very interesting. So the establishment of a theocracy can make it easy to persecute particular targets based on allegations that they are somehow violating the tenets of whatever religion.
Of course, I mean, I think one of Khomeini's first comments on the new government that he was establishing, which we quote in the book, is that this is effectively, I'm kind of paraphrasing, is a government of God, and going against God is blasphemy. And many of the charges that the government now brings against dissidents, one of them is one of the most severe is called muharebe, which is sort of waging war against God. This is a charge that's been used against people who are criticizing the government for its actions, who are protesting, who organize, or this is the government has kind of used its Islamic ideology in this way, and people are aware of this. They understand what's going on, and I think somewhat of a natural reaction has been to seek other religions, or spirituality in another form. I think Buddhism has kind of there's a small trend there, and yoga and these sorts of things, or to just completely become atheist or agnostic.
How did the new regime under Khomeini treat people who had ties to the old government?
There was a round of executions when the regime first took power, particularly of senior military officials. A lot of people fled the country. A lot of people connected to the regime managed to the Shah's regime, the monarchy, managed to flee the country in the first days, weeks, months. But some didn't, and especially for those high-level figures, they faced summary executions. Um, there kind of for others who were at least accused of being connected to the regime, the government started to undertake confiscations of their property, confiscation even for businessmen who were seen as being close to the monarchy. And so that was kind of one very early way that um, the new government that was taking power and kind of shaping was sort of seeking to wrest away resources that it saw as having been ill-gotten, either through corruption or through just too close of ties, or just having belonged to people that it opposed. And we kind of see that sort of reaction starting to form in those very early days and years.
Yagana, you mentioned that Mehdi Karabi, had an interest in redistributing wealth, serving the poor as he saw that Islam required. Those properties and resources were coming sometimes from people who'd had roles in the prior government. How did the country start to change when the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei succeeded Khomeini?
Yeah, Kadrabi really enjoyed a period of like 8 or 9 years during the first decade of the revolution, where his faction was favored to a large extent by Khomeini, his faction of kind of radical Islamic leftists, as opposed to the conservative right. And he saw his mission when it came to these confiscations and handling these properties as liquidating the assets and distributing them to the poor, and in particular to the people that the regime saw as its base, so sort of the conservative or lower middle class kind of poor segments. When Khomeini dies, it's Khamenei who takes power along with the president Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani. And Rafsanjani and Khamenei really allied. They were kind of more on the right side of the political spectrum, and they really allied to push the leftists out of power, and that included Kadrabi. And so over the course of a couple of years, he basically loses all of his major positions. And what he sees is a system that starts to develop where Khamenei in particular is starting to kind of hoard resources. And he's using the very same structures and foundations and organizations that Kadrabi had helped put into place, and which he had spent years, in the first decade of the revolution, sort of finding ways around the bureaucracy for. So these conglomerates or these foundations that were holding these confiscated properties didn't have to abide by the same rules as private businesses. And when another force, a rival force, took them over, that was kind of used against Kadrabi and the leftists. And I think his story kind of offers lessons for people who are in power and maybe even with good intentions, sort of discard the rule of law and accountability, so that they can kind of get to what they see as their good intention. But yeah, the years after Khomeini's death, that kind of leftist faction, even though they were clerics, even though they were quite loyal to the revolution and to Khomeini, they lose a lot of power. And kind of the rest of our the next chapter of Kadrabi's story is sort of what happens after that.
Was he able to do anything to fix the problems in the system that he helped to build with, it sounds like, pretty benevolent intentions?
Um, Ultimately, no. So he does manage to get power again in the 90s, and that's due to kind of the emergence of this reform movement that was pushed along both by deep the sort of movement of millions of young people who kind of wanted more freedoms and were becoming more educated and just demanding more, and then also Kadrabi's faction of leftists sort of started to kind of think about, like, could we reimagine what the revolution could be? Could it be one that actually has could an Islamic state, a theocratic state, offer more civil liberties to people? And so as part of that movement, he did end up being swept into office again, and rises to be the Speaker of Parliament. And in that role, he tries to put limits on these same types of foundations and companies and entities that he had helped create. But at that point, the power of the clerical class and in particular of Khamenei had already grown to be too much. And he finds that there's way too much resistance, and he doesn't have the tools that he needs. So he tries to enforce sort of parliamentary audits of these entities, and he tries to enforce taxation of them, because although they're technically supposed to be charitable entities, they have a lot of for-profit businesses under them at this point, and he basically is stopped at every turn.
You mentioned younger people being politically active. You also write here about an activist and poet who's a member, I think this her birth places her as a member of the millennial generation. Talk about what was significant about coming of age at the time that she did.
Yeah, so this poet is named Hila Sadiri, and she was sort of kind of a tween, like she was around 12 years old, kind of in the mid 90s when this reformist movement really kind of reached its zenith, and millions of Iranians who had never voted before went to the polls and voted for this more moderate cleric named Mohammad Khatami to come into office. And for Hila and her generation, this really represented a widening of their horizons. They received opportunities as a result of this election, and they really grabbed them. They didn't just receive them; they really shaped what this could be. They formed thousands of civil society organizations. They really showed this energy to improve and change their country in modest and kind of step by step, gradual ways. But overall, they had a real goal, which was to kind of make this a more representative government, to make it one that had a stronger social contract with its people, that people could really feel they had more ownership of. And her story really shows the vast investments that they made into that project. And I think kind of what it resulted in, which was a harsh reaction from the state, and ultimately, that project ended up failing.
I thought it was really interesting that you chose to highlight, an incident in her childhood when she felt bullied by a teacher. This is something that could easily, in gathering all this information about her life, could have been overlooked. Talk about why you included that.
Yeah, I mean, we thought that was an interesting anecdote because it represented, so, Hila and her family, they were sort of modern, open to the West, intellectual. Her grandfather was a book publisher. Her family had not supported the revolution. Um, and they kind of represented one class of Iranians. And we felt that it was important to show that they were not alone. There were other sort of like currents in society, and that she was faced with these. And um, this her Quran teacher basically picked on her and bullied her. Hila was remarked upon from a very early age for her beauty, and she was also a brilliant student. And it seems that the combination of these factors sort of set this teacher against her, who really spread quite damaging and kind of nasty rumors about Hila, and really managed to socially isolate her. And I think we wanted to show sort of what it felt like to not just live under kind of the strictures of an Islamic government, but also within society feel like you don't have a place in it, not for necessarily anything wrong you've done. I mean, Hila, even though her family was kind of modern and maybe a bit more liberal, she abided by all of the sort of unofficial rules for girls. You don't linger out in the street and flirt with boys. You don't even laugh too loudly. She was a very modest, kind of like chaste
Mm.
person. Adults would sort of remark upon this, but even that was not enough, and she kind of suffered under this sort of all-encompassing kind of cultural system or ideology. And so we wanted to kind of show that she represented kind of the emergence of this sort of more modern middle class, and a generation of people who didn't want to live under this sort of like oppressive atmosphere anymore, and felt like they wanted to kind of have a say. And so we thought that anecdote kind of showed that what it really felt like to be someone like Hila in that era.
Most people don't realize how much of their personal information is being bought and sold every day. Data brokers are making billions pulling details about you from public records on the internet, then packaging and selling it, usually without your consent. That's how your information lands in the hands of scammers, spammers, even stalkers. It's why you get endless robocalls and why ads seem to follow you everywhere. That's where Aura comes in. Aura actively removes your data from broker sites and keeps it off. They also instantly alert you if your information shows up in a breach or on the dark web. But Aura goes beyond data protection. With one app, you get a VPN, antivirus, password manager, spam call protection, dark web monitoring, and even up to $5 million in identity theft insurance, all backed by 24/7 US-based fraud support. Other companies might sell just credit monitoring or just a VPN. Aura gives you all of it together at the same price competitors charge for just one service. Start your free trial today at aura.com/safer. Protect yourself now at aura.com/safer.
So tell us about her poem Autumn's Rain and what it was about and why it became such a powerful symbol of resistance.
Yeah, so the context of this is that the reform movement sort of morphed over time into what became the Green Movement. The Green Movement in 2009, there was an election that year. Gila's generation, kind of that young generation of activists who had powered the reformists into office, 10, 12 years earlier, they kind of reconstituted to basically help defeat Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the very kind of hardline president at the time. And he was up for re-election, and these sort of more liberal forces united behind a man named Mir Hossein Mousavi. And Mousavi himself is a very interesting figure. He was also kind of an Islamic leftist, like Karoubi, and very kind of beloved by Khomeini. But this young generation also kind of latched onto him as someone with a revolutionary pedigree, but who could also deliver them into a kind of more democratic, liberal future. And so she campaigned for him. She organized for him. Um, the election results are announced, and it's announced that Ahmadinejad has won with an outright majority, a huge majority, and people very quickly disbelieve those results and believe that they had been fraudulent. And people come out and protest. And we kind of see the protests and what happens over the next few weeks and months through Gila's eyes. Um, and many of her friends either leave the country or are arrested. And she's really kind of, through various sort of factors that we explained, she manages to kind of escape arrest, at least initially. And she's walking one day in Tehran, and it starts raining. And she just starts to kind of think of these lines of a poem that are sort of addressed to her fallen or isolated and spirited away sort of comrades. And she writes this very moving poem about kind of presenting them all as sort of students in a classroom, and sort of talking about all the hopes that they had for the future and how she's now alone and without all of them. And she's sort of speaking to one in particular, and uses quite strong critical language, including referencing kind of these reports of rape in prisons of dissidents. And she delivers this remarkably inside the country. And she delivers it twice, one at kind of a smaller poetry forum, and then this very well-known sort of arts figure comes to her and asks him to deliver at his forum, which is a very large and well-known one. And she does that, and it's quite a moving experience for the people who were there. And there's a film of it, and she posts this on her Facebook once it's ready, and she goes to bed. And the next day she wakes up, and it's just like flown around the world,
Mm.
and it's already been translated. And just I remember seeing this, and I was outside the country in 2009. Like, it just went everywhere because it was just such a remarkable, I mean, poetry in Iran just has so much meaning and history and kind of use as a tool of dissent. And people just like say lines of poetry in their daily conversation. It's really very much a art form of the masses. And so there's that element of it. the fact that she's delivering this inside the country, and people were like afraid for her. She was afraid for herself, and but she still was brave enough to do that. I think that really moved people, and it became kind of this symbol of the green movement.
Yagana, I think you say in the book that you and your co-author cannot return to Iran. It's not safe for you at this point. How does that shape the way you're able to write about the country? And how does that affect your ability to cover things when you are physically at a distance?
I think anything is both a disadvantage and an advantage,
Mm.
any facet. So certainly I wish I could walk down the street in Tehran or travel around the country and talk to people from a wide array of social classes and locations, and just kind of get a sense of like what the country feels like. It would certainly enrich my writing and reporting. But the Iranian government arrests dual nationals. Journalists have come under threat, and so it just doesn't. It's not something that has been an option for me for a long time. And so the benefit of that is that I've been able to write investigative stories about the country, about corruption within Iran, including by those at the very top of the power structure, and I feel safe in doing so, and that is a privilege, and one that I feel like I've used to the benefit of kind of public knowledge of what's happening in this country. And of course, there are other ways that I can kind of try to make up for the weaknesses of not being there. So talk to people over the phone. For this book, we talked to people inside the country for dozens and dozens of hours for each person. Or, I recently completed a reporting trip for the New York Times to the eastern, Iran's border with Turkey in eastern Turkey, and talked to people who were coming in and out through the land border or through this train that goes from Tehran to Turkey. So in those ways, I try to kind of keep a finger on the pulse. But certainly, I would love to be able to kind of be there safely and report on what's happening inside.
And you talk about covering corruption. In the book, you write about a bureaucrat who was working inside the government and discovered some graft. Will you tell us about Amir?
Yeah, Amir Muqaddam is a very interesting character because he also was kind of a true believer in the system and was an ideologue. And he, suffers at the hands of Ahmadinejad. We kind of detail what happened to him during that era, and he eventually is able to rejoin the government during the Rouhani era. And Rouhani kind of came after Ahmadinejad and was sort of seen as a more moderate figure. And Amir kind of starts out with a lot of hope in kind of what this new government would bring for Iran, but pretty quickly he sees sort of a level of nepotism and favoritism and corruption within the government in terms of the person that he's working for, bringing in his son, bringing in his son-in-law, who the son-in-law then faced legal cases for his corruption and his use of kind of state resources and potential money laundering. And so these are all things that Amir witnesses. And we sort of use his story to show that for many Iranians, they don't see the problem as just problem with the regime as being just one faction or another. Amir kind of eventually comes to the conclusion that the problem with the Islamic Republic and kind of this unfair system that has resulted really spans factions, including kind of a more moderate one, like the one that Hassan Rouhani was elected to give to the people. So by that era, that is kind of the reality, at least that Amir sees.
I was fascinated by the story of Saeed Rahmani, a tech entrepreneur. What made him want to set up a business in Iran?
Yeah, he has a fascinating story for sure. So Saeed is someone who was raised in Iran and grew up there until he was a teenager, and then he leaves the country to kind of pursue his education and career abroad. But like many, Iranian expatriates, he was a patriot. He had a lot of love for his country, and I think also, is a businessman. And so he spotted an opportunity, but also one that he felt would sort of give back to his country and sort of bring Iran kind of into the modern era. And so he returns first initially kind of in 2011, still in the Ahmadinejad era, remarkably, but he sees that Iranians are kind of starting to form these online businesses. And he had become a tech entrepreneur outside the country, and he just felt like he had a lot to offer these young entrepreneurs, these young founders. And so he decides to return to kind of launch a venture capital fund that would not only invest money, but would also kind of bring international know-how and mentorship to these businesses.
That sounds amazing. Of course, he faced extraordinary challenges from the government, which quickly wanted to control what he was doing.
Yeah, so I think, Saeed and the other startup founders and sort of funders of that era, um, they sort of had a vision that like this, what their project would be kind of a win-win. They would have these successful businesses, but also Iran's economy would grow. And wouldn't this be great? And surely the government would welcome this kind of project. Certainly, there were elements within the government who did want that. So I think the parts of the elected government. So after Ahmadinejad, when Rouhani came into power, they were pursuing the nuclear deal. There was sort of these openings with the rest of the world. I think that part of the government kind of did see the potential of these startups and want to support them. But there was a much more powerful element at play, which was the security state. And this is the Revolutionary Guards, namely, and their intelligence division, but then also kind of this constellation of sort of really entrenched financial interests, both around the guards and then also the kind of clerically controlled conglomerates and kind of bonyads, including the types that Mehdi Karoubi had helped set up in the 80s. They kind of are a continuous player. And so what we really document, both through kind of just like the publicly what was known, and then through many, many interviews and documents that we received and all sorts of investigative sort of methods that we used, is that systematically this security state starts to go after the startups. So it starts with Khamenei giving a speech right after the nuclear deal was signed, saying that, we don't want infiltrators in the country. We don't want these American linked circles of economic interest. That's a vague statement, but it's a pretty accurate description to some people's minds of what the startups were doing. These were sometimes very Western oriented folks. They tended to have links to the West, and they were bringing in kind of a new way of doing business. They were bringing in foreigners to kind of teach the startups how to succeed in these businesses, in these industries. So there's that. After Khamenei's speech, there's editorials in his favored newspaper straight up going after the startups and saying that they are kind of in league with the State Department and kind of trying to carry out a regime change in Iran. There's a mysterious Telegram channel, the social media app that pops up and is naming names and has pictures and information on these startup guys, including Saeed and his company, and saying that they are connected to the West and trying to undertake regime change in Iran. And then really the threats and the interrogations by the intelligence officials start. And the whole sector kind of feels under immense pressure. And what we kind of document is then there's sort of these opportunistic middlemen, people with one foot in the security services. Maybe they used to be, used to work in the defense ministry or at one of these conglomerates, and then one foot in the private sector. And they start coming to these companies and basically saying, if you give us some of your shares, we can protect you. And it was this very kind of systematic effort to take over what once had been for a few years a really thriving, really independent, sort of new dynamic sector of Iran's economy. And over time, this reaction by these forces really brought it to heel.
The Iranian government is hard on all manner of citizens. It does seem like young women who assert autonomy are particular targets. Will you remind us what we know about the death of a young woman named Mahsa Amini in 2022?
Absolutely. So Mahsa Jina Amini, Jina is her Kurdish name. She was a Kurdish Iranian woman who was 22 years old, and she was visiting Tehran from her hometown of Saqqez, which is in Kurdistan, in the Kurdish part of Iran in the west. And she's visiting Tehran with her family on a trip. And she exits a metro station in September 2022. And by all accounts, from what we know, she's wearing fairly modest outfit, a long black robe, kind of like silky, and a sort of thin, silky scarf. Pretty conservative especially by Tehran standards. Nonetheless, she is detained by the morality police who were really out in force that summer. Iran at this point was under a pretty hardline conservative president, and he wanted to enforce the hijab quite strictly. And so she's detained. And from what we know from reports that have emerged from people who were detained with her, she was quite confused and quite worried because she was in a strange city. And so it appears, sort of resisted and then received a beating in the car, in the van on the way to the detention center. And then at the detention center, we have video, surveillance video that shows her kind of holding her head, and then she collapses to the ground. And she ends up being in a coma for close to a week, and then finally passes away on September 16th, 2022. And this just is a spark in a way that I think was somewhat unexpected. But when we kind of look back at the events, we sort of understood why this led to kind of what came after. She's buried in her hometown. The funeral was quite tense, and people there were quite angry over what had happened. And the Kurdish regions of Iran really have kind of a different tradition of opposition and resistance and organization. And so her funeral becomes a site of protest. Women there rip off their headscarves, and there's this very dramatic scene where one of the women who had known Mahsa says, for this filth, she grabs her headscarf. She says, "For this filth, they killed her." And people start chanting "Woman, Life, Freedom," and "Woman, Life, Freedom" being sort of a kind of old Kurdish freedom independence slogan, and other kind of anti-government chants. And partially because of the power of the internet, I think also partially because she died in Tehran and not just in Kurdistan, which maybe could have been ignored by large parts of the population, and partially because many Iranians have themselves been detained by the morality police, or know sisters or wives or mothers who have, and they felt this could have happened to any of them. They really boil over, and we just see the birth of this very powerful movement that has these very powerful symbols and chants, and kind of just takes over the country very quickly.
I mean, other women have taken this on. It is a dangerous thing to protest around to this day.
I think what I would say to that actually is that while Woman Life Freedom did not result in political change, it had immense cultural impact inside the country. And even to this day, where the atmosphere inside Iran is so securitized right now during this ceasefire and war, and people are really afraid to dissent. Even to this day, we see pictures of Tehran, at least, where women are not wearing the hijab. And for even months before the war, years before the war, honestly, really you see a dramatic change after Woman Life Freedom. And when I've talked to people, they say, for a long time, like my conservative family members, they would hassle me over the hijab. I never wanted to wear it. But when I resisted, they would sort of hassle me, and now they don't anymore. I think even among kind of the conservative classes, what happened to Mahsa was sort of a shock. And then there are even women I've spoken with who wore the hijab for years and years and years, and after Woman Life Freedom, they were like, "I'm not ever wearing it again." And they have to bear the cost of that. This government has tried to fine them, impound their cars, do all sorts of things. But a lot of women are like, I'll bear that cost willingly.
Are Iranians likely to experience anything different under the leadership of Khamenei's son after his assassination?
It's still very early days. We still haven't seen Mujtaba Khamenei in public. We haven't heard his voice. We haven't seen a video of him. So we have written statements. That's it. And I think, it's going to take some time to understand sort of what this new era of Iran looks like. Right now, it looks like one that's quite restrictive, more so than even before. And I think, if you read the book, we don't say that it was like a liberal paradise before, but even now it's become even more so. We've seen a spate of executions in the last few weeks, of protesters who were arrested in January. We've seen human rights lawyers arrested. At this moment, I think people feel like the regime has used the war and kind of the conflict to turn its ire on people at home. And of course, the internet was shut down for almost 3 months. And just yesterday, we got news that it's been reopened, and we'll kind of see how long that lasts. But I think for right now, a lot of the Iranians I speak with, especially the ones who oppose the regime, they feel like they're in a worse situation now than they were 3-4 months ago.
How are civilians getting by since the start of the war?
You mean economically?
I mean, economically, how worried are they about rocket attacks? How is day-to-day life proceeding, especially in the big cities that would presumably be targets of Israel or the United States?
Yeah. I think the ceasefire, which happened in April, brought some relief to a measure of people that, like, okay, these attacks that were happening at all hours of the day and night, people weren't sleeping well. They had left the city in a lot of instances. They just were, terrified. That kind of brought a measure of relief and stability. There is a vocal subset of people that I speak with who have very complicated feelings and feel like, well, we've paid this cost. Why don't America and Israel kind of go all the way and, like, quote unquote finish the job? There's never even any really like specific sort of like what does that actually look like, and what does
Yeah.
that mean? And are the US and Israel willing to kind of undertake that kind of campaign, whether that's ground troops or whatever it might be? There's sort of a lack of kind of specificity on that, but that is, I guess, just how people, their raw feelings and how they feel. Economically, people are really struggling, and this is not just because of the cost of the war itself, like the strikes, but also the way that the government has chosen to respond, which was to cut off the internet. A lot of people in Iran, they make money by selling things on Instagram. They at least advertise their businesses on Instagram. A lot of people are on social media. And so that's always been a very powerful tool for the private sector. And that was completely cut off. Even kind of the tech sector that I discussed before, they can access kind of this internal internet, kind of almost like a Chinese style internet that Iran has developed over the past few years. But they still depend on the global internet for software updates, they invest a lot of money in their SEO results on Google. And all that, if Google can't ping their websites because the Iranian internet is shut off and disconnected, then all that money just goes to waste, and they end up being like on the 5th page of Google results or whatever. So these are like small things, but they really, these are the ways that Iran's economy suffers in really tangible ways from the way the government responds to these kind of outside threats. And they received a lot of criticism internally from the private sector and from their own citizens for doing that. So, people they're borrowing money, they're moving in with their family and friends, they're, running down their savings, they're giving up all sorts of even the small luxuries that they had just to be able to afford food. It's a real deterioration in people's living standards.
Yeganeh Torbati is a correspondent for the New York Times covering Iran and co-author of the new book Stolen Revolution: Betrayal and Hope in Modern Iran. Yeganeh, this has been really interesting. Thank you for making time to talk.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Think is distributed by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, anywhere you get podcasts. Again, I'm Chris Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.